Flight attendant targeted black twin brothers seconds later. Their dad grounds the jet. I don't care who you think you are, but your sons need to move from first class. Those seats are reserved for our premium customers. Ma'am, I purchased these tickets myself. We're not moving, and if you persist with this harassment, you'll learn exactly who I am. Dr. James Henderson stood tall in the aisle of Flight 327, his calm demeanor belying the fury in his eyes. At 65, his salt-and-pepper hair and tailored suit commanded respect. But the flight attendant, Cynthia Walsh, merely crossed her arms and raised her chin defiantly. Behind James, his 17-year-old twin sons, Marcus and Michael, sat rigidly in their first-class seats, their matching Howard University sweatshirts a testament to their future plans. The other passengers had fallen silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Many shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Sir, I have the authority to remove anyone from this flight," Cynthia said, her voice rising. "And I'm telling you that there must have been a mistake with your boarding passes." James's voice remained steady. "There's been no mistake except the one you're making right now. My sons and I are staying exactly where we are." "Then I'll have to speak with the captain," Cynthia threatened, reaching for the cabin phone. James nodded slowly. "Please do. And while you're at it, you might want to inform him that without me, Mr. Richard Calloway won't make it through his cardiac surgery tonight." He pulled out a hospital ID badge from his pocket. "Dr. James Henderson, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Memorial Hospital. Mr. Calloway, the owner of this airline, is scheduled for an emergency bypass at 8 o'clock this evening. I'm the surgeon." The color drained from Cynthia's face. Other passengers began to murmur, and a few pulled out their Sony Walkman headphones to better hear the exchange. I'll speak with the captain immediately," she stammered, backing away. James turned to his sons. "Boys, it seems we might be delayed. I hope we don't miss that surgery. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when the Henderson family was preparing for what should have been a routine trip." James replied, sliding a perfect golden pancake onto a waiting plate. "And hurry up, our flight leaves in 3 hours, and you know how hair gets when it snows." Michael bounded down the stairs, duffel bag in hand. "All packed, Dad. Is that real maple syrup? You know we're not kids anymore, right?" James chuckled. "You're heading to college in 8 months. Until then, you're still my boys, and I'm making sure you eat properly." He placed a stack of pancakes in front of Michael. "Where's your brother?" "Still packing. You know Marcus has to bring his entire wardrobe for a 3-day trip." The Henderson men were headed to New York for a special father-sons weekend. James had surprised the boys with tickets to see their favorite basketball team play at Madison Square Garden. It was a bittersweet gift, a celebration of their recent college acceptances, but also an acknowledgement that their time together under one roof was growing short. As they ate breakfast, the telephone rang. James wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and answered. "Dr. Henderson speaking." His expression grew serious as he listened. "Yes, I understand. What's his current status?" James frowned, checking his watch. "I'll be there Monday morning first thing. Make sure Dr. Patterson has the latest scans." He hung up and returned to the table, his mood noticeably dimmed. "Everything okay, Dad?" Michael asked. James nodded slowly. "Richard Calloway, owner of Continental Airways. He's been admitted with severe chest pains. They're stabilizing him for now, but he'll need bypass surgery Monday morning." "Continental Airways." Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Isn't that the airline we're flying today?" "The very same," James confirmed. "I've been his cardiac consultant for years. He's a tough old businessman, but his heart has been giving him trouble." He smiled reassuringly at his sons. "Nothing for us to worry about now. Let's enjoy our weekend. The Knicks await." The drive to O'Hare was slow due to the snowfall, but they allowed plenty of time. As James navigated through the slushy streets, he glanced at his sons in the rearview mirror. Both tall and athletic, they had their mother's warm brown eyes and his own determined chin. Helen would have been so proud of them. Even after 12 years, the thought of his late wife brought an ache to his chest sharper than any cardiac symptom. "You boys have your IDs ready?" James asked as they pulled into the airport parking structure. "And your boarding passes?" "Yes, Dad," they answered in unison, exchanging amused glances. Despite their imminent adulthood, their father still treated them with the same cautious care he had since they were small. After parking, they rolled their suitcases through the crowded airport. The terminal bustled with travelers, many delayed by the snow. The overhead speakers crackled with announcements while travelers clutched their Pan AM and TWA tickets, checking the departure boards anxiously. At the Continental Airways counter, a cheerful agent greeted them. "Good morning, gentlemen. Where are you headed today?" "New York," James replied, presenting their tickets. "First class, 3 seats." The agent typed into her computer terminal. Ah, Dr. Henderson, yes, I have you right here. We're running about 30 minutes behind due to the weather, but we should have you on your way soon. She smiled at the twins. First time in New York, boys? No, ma'am, Michael replied politely. Our grandparents live in Harlem. We visit every summer. Well, enjoy the basketball game, she said, handing them their boarding passes. Gate 14, and they'll begin boarding in about 45 minutes. As they walked away, Marcus nudged his brother. How'd she know about the basketball game? Michael shrugged. Dad probably mentioned it when he booked the tickets. James smiled but said nothing. In truth, he was well known to the airline staff, not just as a frequent flyer, but as Richard Calloway's personal physician. The airline owner insisted that James receive VIP treatment, though James had never been one to flaunt such connections. They stopped for coffee and magazines before heading to the gate. James purchased a newspaper, and the twins grabbed copies of Sports Illustrated and Rolling Stone. The waiting area was crowded, full of passengers bound for LaGuardia. Flight 327 to New York will begin boarding shortly, announced a voice over the intercom. We'd like to invite our first-class passengers and those needing special assistance to board at this time. James gathered his things. That's us, boys. As they approached the gate, a harried-looking gate agent checked their boarding passes and waved them through. On board, they found their first-class seats, a luxury James rarely indulged in, but this was a special occasion. This is awesome, Dad, Marcus said, settling into the wide seat and immediately checking out the menu of complimentary drinks. Yeah, way better than being cramped in coach, Michael agreed, stretching his long legs. James smiled, watching his son's excitement. They'd grown up in comfort, but never excess. He'd made sure they understood the value of money and hard work. This trip was a rare splurge, a celebration of their accomplishments and the bright futures ahead of them. Other first-class passengers boarded businessmen in expensive suits, a famous news anchor James recognized from the evening broadcast, and an elderly couple who smiled warmly at the Henderson family as they took their seats. Then Cynthia Walsh appeared. The flight attendant was in her mid-40s with carefully styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform. She greeted the businessmen and the news anchor by name, offering them drinks before takeoff. When she reached the Henderson row, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice professional but cool. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" James raised an eyebrow but complied, handing over all 3 passes. Cynthia examined them with unusual scrutiny. "Is there a problem?" James asked quietly. No problem," she replied, returning the passes. "Just checking." Her gaze lingered on Marcus and Michael before she moved on to the elderly couple. James felt a familiar unease settle in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times throughout his career and life. As one of the few black cardiac surgeons in Chicago in 1985, he'd become accustomed to having his credentials questioned, to being mistaken for hospital staff rather than the chief surgeon. He'd hoped times were changing, especially for his son's generation, but moments like this suggested otherwise. He said nothing, however. The boys hadn't seemed to notice, and he didn't want to cast a shadow over their weekend. The plane finished boarding, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Good afternoon, folks. This is Captain Robert Thornton speaking. We're looking at a smooth flight to New York today, about 2 hours in the air. We're just waiting for final clearance from the tower, and then we'll be on our way." As the plane sat at the gate, Cynthia returned with drinks for the first-class cabin. She served the businessmen and the news anchor with friendly chat, then placed drinks silently in front of James and his sons. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely. "Could I have some peanuts too, please?" Cynthia looked at him as though he'd asked for something outrageous. "We'll be serving snacks once we're in the air," she said curtly. "You just gave that gentleman peanuts," Michael pointed out, indicating one of the businessmen who was already munching from a small package. The flight attendant's expression hardened. "As I said, regular service begins after takeoff." James placed a calming hand on Michael's arm. "Thank you," he said to Cynthia. "We're happy to wait." As she walked away, Marcus whispered, "What was that about?" James shook his head slightly. "Not now," he murmured. "Let's just enjoy the flight." But the incidents continued. When the meal service began, Cynthia somehow forgot the twins' meals, only bringing them when James explicitly reminded her. She repeatedly checked their seatbelts and tray tables while ignoring similar minor infractions from other passengers. Each interaction was technically within the bounds of her job, but the targeted attention was unmistakable. An hour into the flight, Marcus asked to use the first-class lavatory. Cynthia immediately blocked his path. "The coach lavatories are toward the rear of the aircraft," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We're in first class," Marcus replied, confused. Our seats are right there. There must be some mistake, Cynthia insisted, her voice taking on an edge. These facilities are for first-class passengers only. James, who had been reading his newspaper, looked up. The situation was escalating in a way he'd hoped to avoid. Several other passengers were now watching the exchange, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to outright disapproving, though it wasn't clear who they were disapproving of. "Excuse me," James said, rising from his seat. "My sons and I are first-class passengers, as our boarding passes clearly showed. There's no mistake." Cynthia's eyes narrowed. "Sir, perhaps you were upgraded due to the flight being overbooked. These young men don't appear to be typical first-class travelers." The implication hung in the air. James felt a slow burn of anger rise in his chest, but his face remained composed, a skill he'd perfected in high-pressure operating rooms and countless encounters like this one. "My sons are exactly where they belong," he said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us." But Cynthia didn't move. Instead, she gestured to another flight attendant. "Janet, please inform the captain we have a situation in first class." The elderly couple who had smiled at them earlier now looked openly concerned. The woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something, and he nodded gravely. "Dad, it's fine," Marcus said quietly. "I can use the other bathroom." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "No, son, it's not fine." Janet returned with a message from the captain. She whispered something to Cynthia, who seemed increasingly agitated. "The captain says to let the passengers use the facilities," Janet said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Cynthia's face flushed, but she stepped aside, allowing Marcus to pass. James remained standing, watching as his son disappeared into the lavatory. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The elderly gentleman across the aisle cleared his throat. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Cynthia. "My wife and I couldn't help but notice your treatment of these gentlemen. We've been flying Continental for 30 years, and we've never seen such behavior from staff." Cynthia's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing naked annoyance. "Sir, I'm simply following protocol." "No," the elderly man said firmly. "You're not, and we'll be speaking to Richard about this when we land. Richard Calloway. He's our nephew." Now Cynthia paled slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Barrett, I didn't realize." "Clearly," Mrs. Barrett said coldly. Marcus returned from the lavatory, sensing the tension but unsure of its cause. He slipped back into his seat beside Michael, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing anger. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Michael asked. James nodded, though his expression remained grave. "Everything's fine, son," but it wasn't fine, and everyone knew it. Cynthia retreated to the galley, and the first-class cabin settled into an uncomfortable silence. James returned to his newspaper, though his mind was far from the words on the page. He was calculating his response, weighing his options as carefully as he did when planning a difficult surgery. 30 minutes later, Captain Thornton's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we're beginning our initial descent into New York. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Cynthia emerged from the galley, her professional smile firmly back in place. She checked seat backs and tray tables, moving efficiently through the cabin. When she reached the Henderson row, however, her demeanor changed again. "I need you to put your seats in the upright position," she said to the twins, though their seats were already properly positioned. "They are upright," Michael replied, his patience wearing thin. "Don't argue with me," Cynthia snapped. "And make sure your carry-ons are completely under the seats." James had had enough. "Ms. Walsh," he said, reading her name tag for the first time. "I'd like to speak with the captain upon landing." "The captain is busy flying the plane, sir," she replied dismissively. "Nevertheless, I believe he'll want to speak with me. Please inform him that Dr. James Henderson wishes to discuss the treatment my family has received on this flight." Something in his tone must have finally registered with Cynthia. She studied his face more carefully. "Dr. Henderson, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Memorial Hospital in Chicago," he confirmed. "I believe Continental Airways has a corporate account with us." Recognition dawned in Cynthia's eyes, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The plane descended through the clouds toward LaGuardia Airport, the New York skyline visible through the windows. As the aircraft touched down and taxied to the gate, James could see his sons exchanging glances. They had questions, he could read it in their expressions, but they remained silent, following his lead as they always had. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. James motioned for his sons to remain seated as others filed past them toward the exit. Cynthia was nowhere to be seen. Finally, when most passengers had deplaned, Captain Thornton emerged from the cockpit. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with the confident bearing of a pilot who had navigated both aircraft and corporate politics successfully for decades. "Dr. Henderson," he said, approaching their row, I understand there was some trouble during the flight. James stood and extended his hand. Captain Thornton, yes, I'm afraid there was. My sons and I were subjected to discriminatory treatment by your flight attendant. The captain shook James's hand firmly. I've heard some concerning reports from several passengers. I'd like to apologize personally and assure you that Continental Airways does not condone such behavior. I appreciate that, Captain, but an apology isn't enough. This incident requires more substantial action. Thornton nodded solemnly. I agree. Would you be willing to file a formal complaint? I'll provide my personal statement as well. I will, James said. And I should mention that I'm scheduled to perform bypass surgery on Richard Calloway Monday morning. I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about this incident directly. The captain's eyes widened slightly. Richard Calloway is your patient. For many years now, James confirmed. He's struggled with his heart condition, but he's a fighter. I expect he'll make a full recovery, assuming he receives the best possible care. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but the implication was clear. James would never compromise a patient's care for personal reasons, but Thornton couldn't know that. I understand, the captain said. I'll personally ensure this matter receives the highest level of attention. Ms. Walsh will be suspended pending a full investigation. Marcus and Michael stood now, towering beside their father, their expressions serious but composed. James had taught them well to stand up for themselves with dignity, to demand respect without losing their own. Thank you, Captain, James said. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a basketball game to attend. As they walked through the jetway into the terminal, Michael finally spoke. Dad, why didn't you say something earlier? Why let her treat us that way the whole flight? James sighed, placing a hand on each of his son's shoulders. Sometimes you need to choose your battles carefully. I wanted to see how far it would go to establish a pattern of behavior that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding. But it was humiliating, Marcus said quietly. James stopped walking and turned to face his sons directly. Listen to me, both of you. There's nothing humiliating about maintaining your dignity in the face of someone else's ignorance. You did nothing wrong. You were exactly where you belonged. The shame is hers, not yours. The twins nodded, but James could see they weren't entirely convinced. This was a conversation they would need to continue, one of many difficult discussions he'd had with them over the years about navigating a world that wouldn't always see their worth. For now, though, they had a weekend to enjoy. Let's grab our bags and find a taxi, James said. The Knicks aren't going to wait for us. 2 days later, they returned to the airport for their flight home. James had debated changing airlines but decided against it. Running away solved nothing, and he wanted his sons to see this through to its conclusion. At the Continental check-in counter, they were greeted by a manager who introduced herself as Susan Reynolds. Dr. Henderson, we've been expecting you. On behalf of Continental Airways, I want to personally apologize for your experience on Friday's flight. We've upgraded your family to our premium first-class service today, and Mr. Calloway himself asked me to give you this. She handed James an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. James, I was dismayed to hear about the treatment you and your boys received. This is not the airline I built, and rest assured, appropriate actions have been taken. Cynthia Walsh is no longer employed by Continental. Please accept my sincerest apologies and know that I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow morning, though I admit I'm not looking forward to the surgery itself. Safe travels, Richard. James folded the note and returned it to the envelope. Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. Your gate is 22 and will begin boarding in about an hour. Is there anything else you need? James looked at his sons, who were watching the exchange with interest. No, he said. I believe everything has been addressed appropriately. As they walked toward security, Michael asked, So she got fired? James nodded. Actions have consequences. In medicine, we have a saying, first do no harm. It's a principle that should extend beyond healthcare. She harmed people with her actions, not just us, but everyone who witnessed discrimination and said nothing. Like those businessmen who just watched it happen, Marcus noted. Exactly, James agreed. Silence in the face of injustice is its own form of complicity. At Gate 22, they found a very different atmosphere from their outbound flight. The gate agents were almost too attentive, the crew exceptionally polite. As they boarded, the new first-class flight attendant, a young woman named Maria, welcomed them warmly and without a hint of the previous attendant's prejudice. The flight home was uneventful, but as they soared above the clouds, James found himself reflecting on the weekend. His sons were on the cusp of manhood, about to enter a world that would challenge them in ways both familiar and new. He wouldn't always be there to fight their battles, but he hoped he had shown them how to fight their own with dignity, intelligence, and strategic patience. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, James turned to his sons. I want you both to know how proud I am of you, not just for your accomplishments, but for who you are. The way you handled yourselves during that confrontation showed character. The twins exchanged glances, a silent communication that James had never quite been able to decode. We learned from the best, Dad, Michael said finally. Yeah, Marcus added. You always said we should fight the battles that matter. James smiled, his heart full. And always remember that you belong anywhere you choose to be. Never let anyone make you believe otherwise. The plane touched down smoothly on Chicago soil, bringing them home changed in subtle but important ways. The incident that had threatened to ruin their trip had instead become a powerful lesson, one they would carry with them long after the memory of the basketball game faded. Now, back to where we started. On that return flight, just as the confrontation between Dr. Henderson and Cynthia Walsh was reaching its climax. I don't care who you think you are, but your sons need to move from first class. Those seats are reserved for our premium customers. Ma'am, I purchased these tickets myself. We're not moving, and if you persist with this harassment, you'll learn exactly who I am. Dr. James Henderson stood tall in the aisle of Flight 327, his calm demeanor belying the fury in his eyes. At 65, his salt-and-pepper hair and tailored suit commanded respect, but the flight attendant, Cynthia Walsh, merely crossed her arms and raised her chin defiantly. Behind James, his 17-year-old twin sons, Marcus and Michael, sat rigidly in their first-class seats, their matching Howard University sweatshirts a testament to their future plans. The other passengers had fallen silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Many shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sir, I have the authority to remove anyone from this flight, Cynthia said, her voice rising. And I'm telling you that there must have been a mistake with your boarding passes. James's voice remained steady. There's been no mistake except the one you're making right now. My sons and I are staying exactly where we are. Then I'll have to speak with the captain, Cynthia threatened, reaching for the cabin phone. James nodded slowly. Please do, and while you're at it, you might want to inform him that without me, Mr. Richard Calloway won't make it through his cardiac surgery tonight. He pulled out a hospital ID badge from his pocket. Dr. James Henderson, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Memorial Hospital. Mr. Calloway, the owner of this airline, is scheduled for an emergency bypass at 8 o'clock this evening. I'm the surgeon. The color drained from Cynthia's face. Other passengers began to murmur, and a few pulled out their Sony Walkman headphones to better hear the exchange. I'll speak with the captain immediately, she stammered, backing away. Captain Thornton appeared from the cockpit moments later, his expression grave. Dr. Henderson, I understand there's a situation here. Yes, Captain. Your flight attendant seems to believe my sons don't belong in first class. She's been harassing us since we boarded, and now she's attempting to have us removed from our seats. The captain turned to Cynthia. Is this true, Ms. Walsh? Cynthia's professional demeanor crumbled. I was simply enforcing our standards, Captain. These young men don't meet the typical profile of our first-class passengers. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin. The elderly couple from the outbound flight, the Barretts, were coincidentally on this return journey as well, and Mrs. Barrett spoke up clearly. That's discrimination, plain and simple, she declared. And we witnessed the same behavior on Friday's flight. Captain Thornton's expression hardened. Ms. Walsh, please return to the galley. We'll discuss this after landing. He turned back to James. Dr. Henderson, I apologize sincerely for this incident. Please remain in your seats. I'll personally ensure you and your sons are treated with the respect you deserve for the remainder of the flight. But James shook his head. I'm afraid that's not good enough, Captain. This isn't an isolated incident, and it's not about our comfort for the next 2 hours. It's about a pattern of behavior that your airline has tolerated. The captain frowned. What are you suggesting, Doctor? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. Until this matter is addressed properly, this plane isn't leaving the gate. A tense silence fell over the cabin. The other passengers watched with rapt attention, witnesses to a moment of both personal and broader significance. Dr. Henderson, the captain said quietly, you know I can't delay this flight without cause. Discrimination is cause, Captain Thornton, James replied firmly. And as Mr. Calloway's physician, I have a medical responsibility to ensure I arrive in Chicago with sufficient time to prepare for his surgery. The stress of this situation has already delayed us unnecessarily. It was a strategic pivot, framing the issue as both a matter of principle and a medical necessity. James knew the captain couldn't argue with either point without creating even more problems for the airline. After a long moment, Captain Thornton nodded. You're right, of course. He turned to address the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll be returning to the gate briefly to address a personnel issue. We should be on our way shortly. As the captain returned to the cockpit, passengers began to whisper among themselves. Some looked annoyed at the delay, but many others nodded in approval. The Barretts gave James a supportive smile. The plane slowly taxied back to the gate. Through the windows, James could see ground crew expressing confusion at the unexpected return. "Dad," Michael whispered, "are they really going to kick her off the plane?" James placed a calming hand on his son's arm. "This isn't about punishment, Michael. It's about accountability. Sometimes people need to face immediate consequences to understand the impact of their actions." At the gate, the cabin door opened, and two airline officials boarded. They spoke briefly with Captain Thornton before approaching Cynthia in the galley. After a hushed conversation, Cynthia collected her purse from a storage compartment and, without making eye contact with anyone, left the aircraft. One of the officials then addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience. We'll be bringing on a replacement crew member, and we'll be on our way in just a few minutes. Thank you for your patience." As promised, a new flight attendant boarded shortly afterward. Maria, the same young woman who had served them so professionally on their outbound journey, greeted the passengers with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard Flight 327 to Chicago," she announced. "We're running a bit behind schedule, but we'll do our best to make up the time in the air. Can I get anyone a drink before takeoff?" The atmosphere in the cabin noticeably lightened. Passengers returned to their books and magazines, the brief drama already becoming a story they would tell at dinner that evening. Maria approached the Henderson row. "Dr. Henderson, Marcus, Michael, it's good to see you again. Can I get you anything before we depart?" James smiled. "Thank you, Maria. Just water for now." As she moved on to the next row, Marcus leaned toward his father. "She remembered our names." "Simple courtesy," James said. "That's all anyone asks for. To be seen as an individual, not as a category." The plane finally took off, nearly 40 minutes behind schedule. As they climbed into the clouds, James gazed out the window at the shrinking New York skyline. The weekend had not gone as planned, but perhaps it had been more valuable than a simple basketball trip. The next morning, James stood scrubbed and gowned in operating room 3 at Memorial Hospital. The cardiac team moved with practiced precision around him as they prepared for Richard Calloway's bypass surgery. "BP is stable, doctor," the anesthesiologist reported. "Patient is ready for incision." James nodded to his surgical team. "Let's begin." As he made the first careful cut, James's mind was clear, focused entirely on the task at hand. The events of the weekend, the confrontation on the plane, all of it faded away in the face of his responsibility to this patient. 4 hours later, the surgery was complete. James had performed thousands of similar procedures throughout his career, but each one represented a life in his hands, a sacred trust he never took lightly. In the recovery room, he checked Calloway's vital signs one more time before leaving instructions with the nursing staff. The airline owner would likely make a full recovery. He was otherwise healthy, and the surgery had gone smoothly. As James was leaving the hospital, his pager beeped. A message from Calloway's administrative assistant requested that he stop by the patient's private room once Calloway was awake and stable. That evening, James returned to the hospital. Calloway was propped up in bed, pale but alert, various tubes and monitors attached to his body. "James," the older man greeted him weakly. "They tell me everything went well." "As well as could be expected," James confirmed, checking the monitors out of habit. "You should be back on your feet in no time, though you'll need to make some lifestyle changes." Calloway nodded. "The usual lecture about stress and diet, I assume." He gestured to a chair beside the bed. "Please sit. I wanted to speak with you about what happened on my airline." James sat, though he maintained his professional demeanor. "Richard, you don't need to concern yourself with that right now. You should be focusing on recovery." "Nonsense. A man nearly dies. It tends to clarify his priorities." Calloway adjusted his position slightly, wincing. "I've spent 50 years building Continental, James. Started with 2 planes after Korea, built it into what it is today. Always prided myself on running a tight ship." James remained silent, allowing his patient to continue. "Never occurred to me that I might be harboring people like that Walsh woman. Makes me wonder what else I've been missing." Calloway's voice was growing stronger as he spoke, his natural authority returning despite his weakened state. "One incident doesn't define your airline, Richard," James said diplomatically. "Maybe not, but how we respond to it might." Calloway fixed James with a penetrating look. "I've already spoken with my board. We're implementing a comprehensive anti-discrimination training program for all staff, effective immediately. and I'd like you to consult on it if you're willing." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I'm a heart surgeon, Richard, not a diversity consultant. You're also a black man who's navigated predominantly white institutions your entire career. Medical school in the 60s, chief of surgery in the 80s. You know more about this than most so-called experts." Calloway coughed slightly, and James automatically reached for the water cup on the bedside table, holding the straw to his patient's lips. After taking a sip, Calloway continued. "Besides, you've got twin boys heading to college soon, right? The world they're entering should be better than the one you and I grew up in." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not the warning sign of cardiac distress, but the emotion that always surfaced when he thought about his son's futures. "I'll consider it," he said finally, "but my primary concern right now is your recovery. We can discuss business ventures after you're discharged." Calloway smiled weakly. "Always the doctor first." "That's why I trust you with my heart, James." His eyes began to droop, the medication and post-surgical exhaustion taking their toll. "We'll talk soon." 6 weeks later, James stood at a podium in Continental Airways corporate headquarters. Before him sat 200 airline employees, pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and executives, all there for the launch of the company's new training program. "Good morning," James began. "I'm Dr. James Henderson. Some of you may know me as the surgeon who performed Mr. Calloway's bypass operation. Others might recognize me from an incident on Flight 327 earlier this year." A murmur went through the audience. The story had become something of a legend within the company. "I'm not here to dwell on that incident, but rather to help ensure it doesn't happen again to anyone, anywhere in your organization. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's bad business. It creates hostile environments, damages your brand, and ultimately costs you customers." From the front row, Richard Calloway nodded encouragingly. Beside him sat Marcus and Michael, now in their final months of high school, poised on the edge of their adult lives. They watched their father with undisguised pride. "But more importantly," James continued, "addressing discrimination is about recognizing the basic dignity inherent in every human being. In my operating room, I've held the hearts of people from all walks of life. Rich, poor, black, white, young, old, beneath the surface, those hearts are remarkably similar. They all deserve the same care, the same respect, the same chance to keep beating." As James continued his presentation, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A weekend trip that became a turning point, a confrontation that led to transformation. And his sons, witnessing it all, learning lessons more valuable than anything they'd study in college. In the months that followed, Continental Airways became an industry leader in equitable practices. Richard Calloway, perhaps motivated by his brush with mortality, dedicated himself to transforming the company culture. The training program expanded to other airlines, then to other industries. It wasn't perfect, no single initiative could eradicate prejudice overnight, but it was progress. For the Henderson family, the incident became a touchstone, a story they would reference in future conversations about courage, strategy, and dignity. When the twins left for college that fall, they carried with them not just their father's love and support, but also the living example of how to navigate a complex and sometimes hostile world with grace and determination. James, watching his sons walk across the graduation stage the following spring, felt Helen's presence beside him. She would have been so proud of the young men they had raised and perhaps of the man he had continued to become in her absence. Every day, he tried to honor her memory by living with the integrity and compassion she had always shown. As for Cynthia Walsh, James never learned what became of her after that day on the plane. He hoped, perhaps optimistically, that the experience had sparked some reflection, some growth. Transformation, after all, was possible for everyone, even those who might seem beyond reach. In his cardiac practice, James often told patients that healing was a journey, not a destination. The same, he had come to believe, was true for society. Progress came not in grand, sweeping changes, but in individual moments of courage, in personal stands against injustice, in refusing to accept the unacceptable. One flight, one confrontation, one man's decision not to move, small actions that created ripples, that changed trajectories, that opened new possibilities for the future. For James Henderson and his sons, it was simply another lesson in living with dignity. For Continental Airways, it was the beginning of a corporate transformation. And for those who witnessed it, the passengers, the crew members, even Richard Calloway himself, it was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statement is the simple insistence, "We're not moving. Thank you for listening." If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.